Dr. Shabir, welcome to Let the Quran Speak.
It's my pleasure to be on.
We've been talking about interfaith marriage in the past. We looked at how Muslims view interfaith marriage and particularly how the Quran looks at it. But I thought it would be interesting to widen our focus a little bit and look at how other religions view interfaith marriage. What have you found in your study of other religions?
I found some interesting tidbits. And, in our modern times, we think of openness and wide acceptance of a variety of views and tolerance towards and acceptance of other religions and so on. So you would think that the world's religions in general might be moving in that direction to be more inclusive. And of course, within all of the world's major religions, you have movements in that direction. But you also have a traditional bent. You also have the way in which the religions have been established and what is the traditional basic presupposition. The traditional basic presupposition in many of the world's great religions is that people marry only within the faith. And marrying outside of the faith, sometimes there is no way of incorporating such a marriage within the religious system. It might be tolerated. Somebody may be allowed to have a civic wedding, and maybe you can have some kind of makeshift sort of celebration with some religious overtones. But the full acceptance is very hard to amalgamate with the traditional religious presupposition.
So can we look at some religions then? Maybe let's start with Judaism.
Yes. So Judaism obviously is heavily based on the Old Testament, or what Christians call the Old Testament, the Tanakh, the Hebrew Scriptures. In Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse number 3, there is an interdiction against marrying from among the various tribes, the Canaanites, the Hivites, and so on. And that seems to be like an ongoing presupposition, though many of the biblical figures, Moses, for example, is known to have had a non-Jewish wife or a wife from outside of the Israelite circles, and so too many other important figures of the Bible. But later on in the Bible, we have Nehemiah speaking against marrying outside of the religion. And Ezra came down so heavily as to say that if one had a spouse of another faith or outside of the Israelite community, then one should actually divorce. He made that necessary. So when traditionalists would read that, they would say that, okay, marrying outside of the Jewish circles is not allowed. And then you can have many modern varieties of that. So Orthodox and conservatives will tend to lean in that direction of the literal or semi-literal application, maintaining that tradition. Reform Jews or Reconstructionists would head in a more modern direction and be more tolerant. Yet we see that sometimes there is especially among the Reform, there could be a sort of ambivalence, and the those who follow Reconstructionist, I don't know if I'm saying the word correctly, Judaism would have more of an openness to welcome an interfaith marriage.
What about Christianity? I know there are many denominations, so there may be different perspectives on this matter.
Yeah, so Christianity is based not only in the Old Testament, but also on the New. But naturally, the Old Testament being a larger book with more said on this matter would have an overarching influence. But the influence doesn't stop there. There are specific passages in the New Testament that deal with the question, especially in the writings of Paul. So Paul, in his first letter to the Corinthians, showed a sort of openness to the interfaith marriage, but it seems that there he was talking about the marriage as it already is. So we can imagine a situation where there were few Christians, many non-Christians. Those Christians who became Christians, left their non-Christian past, and they may already have been married. And so you have two persons married, both non-Christian. One becomes a Christian, then what's to be done with the non-Christian spouse? So it seems that Paul is saying there that, okay, you have the non-Christian spouse, just live with that, and there is great hope that this non-Christian spouse will eventually convert to your faith as well. In his second letter to the Corinthians, Corinthians, he seems to be taking a more aloof stance and saying now that it is not right for a Christian to be yoked with a non-Christian. Now, he may not have been speaking about marriage in particular. It's not so very clear, but many interpret this as meaning that you cannot tie the knot with meaning the wedding knot with a non-Christian, and. So we have this sort of ambivalence with two different sorts of interpretations. Some Christians being open to interfaith marriages, and some being more traditional and not so open. Mm-hmm. In any case, on my way to the studio this morning, I was listening to some Christian expositors explaining their view about this, and some are saying very clearly that no, a Christian should not marry a non-Christian, and some have given practical reasons. Like, let's say, you're thinking about all your decisions are going to be made with Jesus in mind. And if you're married to a non-Christian spouse, how are you going to discuss what your thinking? You're going to have to keep that aspect of your thinking quite hidden, because the moment you're going to say, okay, but I feel that Jesus is telling me this, that's not going to go down very well in your conversation about whether you're planning to move to a particular neighborhood or send your kids to a particular school or something like this. So
Dr. Shabir, when I look at all of the world religions, Hinduism, Sikhism, even Baha'is have some restrictions, right? The Quran, the Muslims in the Quran have certain allowances. Why do you think that the Quran has these allowances for interfaith marriage, whereas these other religions might not?
It seems that the Quran wanted to have a more inclusive sort of society in which there is mutual tolerance and acceptance. The Quran it gives an impression that prophets and messengers have come to all people. People have been guided in their own way. They have their religions. We should compete with each other in doing good things and so on. At the same time, as we have explained, there are restrictions in the Quran as well. It says, do not marry a polytheist, for example. And for the same practical reason that I've just mentioned from a Christian pastor, in that if you're going to do everything with God in mind, well then how are you going to have decisions made jointly with another person for whom this is quite strange, that you're going to have God at the center of all of this.
And I guess there's a fear also about whether one would retain one's faith after marriage, and then what would happen to the children.
Exactly.
How would they be brought up?
And what faith would the children be brought up? And how would you be instructing your children on the faith if the child is, nowadays for Muslims, it's an ongoing concern that children are asked, well, why do I have to be Muslim? So if you're telling your child, well, you have to be Muslim, and the child is saying, but mom is not a Muslim, or dad is not a Muslim, you can see the difficulty there. Or mom isn't praying, or dad isn't praying, and so on and so forth. So yeah, we see very good reasons for marrying within the faith. And for these good reasons, we see that across the board, many of the world's religions, even ones which are generally very tolerant, like Hinduism, for example, is very open to the idea that there are many paths that lead to salvation. And yet, partly because of the caste system, there is an insistence in marrying within certain circles. And we see a certain sort of restriction in Sikhism, in Baha'ism as well, though these are generally more inclusive faiths.
There's so much more we could talk about, but thank you for sharing these little tidbits with us.
You're welcome.
If you enjoyed this video, click like and subscribe, and please donate to support our work at QuranSpeaks.com.